what really stands out to me from the Jefferson presidency, you mentioned obviously Louisiana Purchase is a huge deal, and the leadership trait that I ascribe to that transaction is that of principled pragmatism. That on the one hand, when Napoleon brought this opportunity to Jefferson at such a bargain price, Jefferson's first reaction was, hey, I've read the Constitution. I think that before we can make this deal, we got to have a constitutional amendment. But then he realized that that would take quite a bit of time. And during that time, Napoleon might well change his mind and the opportunity would go away. And so he modified his principles about the importance of a constitutional amendment and moved forward with pragmatism not to lose what was obviously an unbelievable deal that doubled the size of the country. So this concept of principled pragmatism is one that essential to being a successful president and political leader.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized today's event. This is one of over 1,000 programs we've done from the Commonwealth Club since the pandemic began, and hopefully ended, more or less. We have brought to you with our technology authors from all around the world, and we're doing that again today. We have Talmadge Boston here to speak about his book, How the Best Did It. First question I have for you is, what prompted this project? You've written a lot of other books. What made you come up with this? You have great stories about the 8 presidents that you picked. But how did this project come about?
Well, the book is dedicated to my friend David Stewart, who's one of the country's leading historians. And about 3.5 years ago, David wrote a wonderful biography of George Washington, which basically explained how George Washington did it. Mm-hmm. In terms of being unanimously chosen to be the head of the Continental Army, unanimously chosen to be the head of the Constitutional Convention, unanimously chosen to be president for his first term, and unanimously chosen for his second term. And I thought it was such a good approach to bringing history to readers' attention in a really fascinating perspective. I thought to myself, I'd like to do that for the 8 greatest presidents, not just George Washington. Mm-hmm. David Stewart was a very prominent and successful lawyer in D.C. before he became a top historian, and I've been a full-time lawyer for 46 years, as well as a historian. I haven't been doing it as long as David has. So he's a real mentor to me, and the Washington book was the real genesis of the idea. I had the honor of speaking in person pre-COVID at the Commonwealth Club in 2016 on my last book, which was a presidential history book called Cross-Examining History. A Lawyer Gets Answers from the Experts about Our Presidents that Ken Burns wrote the foreword to. So anyway, I knew I wanted to write another presidential history book, and it was just one of these deals where it's like all my books, it seems like it's a God thing. You just get this inspiration, you have an epiphany, and the next thing you know, you're off and running with an idea. And that's how the idea came about. And it was basically, like all my books, a 2-year project. And every time I finished each of the 8 chapters and was ready to send it in to my publisher, I had at least 2 leading biographers of that president read the final draft of the chapter and give me some feedback. Did I miss something? Did I misstate something? Do you basically agree with my conclusions? And got a few tweaks, which I incorporated into the final version. And so if anybody's wondering, why should I trust conclusions on presidential history from a Dallas lawyer, the conclusions in these chapters have been vetted by the country's leading presidential historians, and you can see that on the dust jacket, where on the back, oh, look, you've got the book. Anyway, here's the book. How do I do that? And on the back, you have the endorsements by David Stewart on my Washington chapter, Annette Gordon-Reed on my Jefferson chapter, Ronald White on my Lincoln chapter, Doug Brinkley on my Theodore Roosevelt chapter, Doris Kearns Goodwin on my FDR chapter, Evan Thomas on my Eisenhower chapter, Mark Updegrove on my Kennedy chapter, and Will Inboden on my Reagan chapter. So, and John Meacham endorsed it on the front of the dust jacket for the whole book. So anyway, I feel like the conclusions have been thoroughly vetted, and And I'm one of the things that I do in Dallas, besides practice law and write books and be a contributing columnist for the Dallas Morning News, is every month a leading author who's usually a historian comes through town on their national book tour. And I do interview programs like you're doing today with them at live events. So I have this network of historian friends who come through Dallas every time they have a new book out. And so I have a good source of getting feedback from top historians.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that you said, of course, was that David Stewart was also a lawyer. Why do you think there's anything about our particular time and place in history that makes lawyers want to look back in history and find people who knew what they were doing with the rule of law?
I think ever since the phenomenon of Scott Turow and John Grisham in the late 80s, lawyers who obviously we do a lot of writing as part of what we do as lawyers. We do a lot of analysis. Most lawyers seem to be history buffs. And so for those of us who don't have the fertile imagination of Grisham and Turow and Richard North Patterson and some other prominent lawyer novelists, but who love history, we're looking for outlets for our creativity. And if we can't paint, we can't play a musical instrument or something along those lines, the opportunity and the pursuit to, in fact, write a book seems like a logical thing to do. And so I don't know that we're doing it so much in support of the rule of law, although obviously that's very important to us. But it's more just having an outlet for creativity and hopefully making a contribution to history. That's certainly my goal. And I think that's the goal of David Stewart and other lawyers who write history books. So
let's start with George Washington. We'll go right through them in the order that they were our presidents. You have an interesting approach in that you analyze the parts of their leadership that were very effective, and then you also mention the things that they were weak on. With a little bit of hope maybe that somebody would eliminate all their weaknesses and just have the strengths and be one of our leaders in the future. I'm sure you didn't have that hope.
I mean, my friend Mark Updegrove, who used to be the head of the LBJ Library, now he's head of the LBJ Foundation, and he's written several wonderful presidential biographies. But when I embarked on this project and I told Mark about it and sent him my first chapter, he said, no, for each one of these chapters, you got to have a section on the president's flaws. You know, you can't put these people on pedestals. You can't just talk about all the positives and none of the negatives. It's what Ken Burns calls emotional archaeology, which he thinks is essential in all of his documentary films. And so the thrust of each chapter is obviously on each of the president's most important leadership traits that caused him to be successful. Then toward the end, we have the section on I have the section on the president's flaws. And then at the conclusion is what I call personal application. The target audience for this book is anybody who is or aspires to be a leader in any field of endeavor, not just politics, any field of endeavor. And so what I'm trying to do is have an interactive experience for the reader with these series of questions for the reader to ask him or herself, how am I doing in the specific leadership traits in the chapter I just read? And so it's not just a presidential history book, it's also a leadership book.
Good question. Do you think any of the 8 presidents asked themselves that question? How am I doing? You know, I mean, or do you think all of them did? Yeah.
I think they all do, because each president, I think, has in the forefront of his brain, how am I going to be remembered by history? What's my legacy going to be? Am I going to be viewed in future generations as having been successful or unsuccessful or somewhere in between? And I think they all have high ambitions to be remembered favorably, and that inspires them to do the best they can with what they've got. Unfortunately, as history demonstrates, with our 46 presidents, In fact, we've not had many great presidents. We've had, from my perspective, 10 or less, which is obviously less than 25%. We've had some good ones. We've had some mediocre ones. We've had some bad ones. We've had some very bad ones. So anyway, I think we need to focus on what the best ones did. Like if you were aspiring to be a great basketball player, you'd want to be emulating and learning from the greatest basketball players, not from the worst basketball players. And so that's true in any field of endeavor. Actors and actresses, who are they looking to as to best ways to do the job? And so that's why I focused on these best. You may wonder, how did I go about picking my 8 best? And the answer is, as you probably know, the C-SPAN television network, every time one president leaves the White House and a new one comes in, for the last several decades, C-SPAN has the country's top 150 historians, and they ask him to rate all the presidents from best to worst on the basis of 10 presidential leadership traits. And the audience can go to C-SPAN presidential ranking poll and read all about it. The last 2 times they've done that poll was in 2017 when Obama went out and Trump came in, and 2021 when Trump went out and Biden came in. And the results of the poll in 2017, 2021 for presidents 1 through 9 were identical. Number 1, Lincoln. Number 2, Washington. Number 3, FDR. Number 4, Theodore Roosevelt. Number 5, Eisenhower. Number 6, Truman. Number 7, Jefferson. Number 8, Kennedy. And number 9, Reagan. So the only adjustment that I made to the C-SPAN poll was I think Truman's overrated. I think the best thing that ever happened to Truman was David McCullough wrote a Pulitzer-winning, wonderful biography of him. But he got us into Korea and had no idea how to get us out. McCarthyism raised its ugly head during his presidency, and he had a total lack of success in dealing with McCarthy. He gets credit for dropping the bombs and bringing a prompt end to World War II, and yet he had to drop the bombs because Plan B would have been Allied forces, predominantly American forces, invading Japan, which would have necessitated the loss of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. So I think Truman is overrated, and I think Reagan's underrated. So I took Truman out. I moved Reagan up 1. So that's part 1 of how I chose these 8. Secondly, I'm trying to sell this book to both Democrats and Republicans. So in the modern era, I wanted to have 2 great Democratic presidents, FDR and JFK, and 2 great Republican presidents, Eisenhower and Reagan. And then the third part of my answer is, in 2024, with the horrible polarization that we've have now and have had for the last few years, I want Republicans to read and recognize that we've had great Democratic presidents. And I want Democrats to read and recognize that we've had great Republican presidents. And let's stop thinking and classifying and generalizing on the basis of party affiliations, and let's just look at the record and draw conclusions about our most successful presidents and what it was that caused him to be successful.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you take some of the presidents have been very polarizing at the time that they became president and for a while they were president, but every year after their presidency, people looked more and more fondly back at what they had done that was better. I think both Reagan and FDR as good examples of that. Even JFK wasn't that popular for a while, but it's interesting that a large amount of it is the style of leadership, even more than the accomplishments, to be a great leader.
Harry Truman famously said that it takes 50 years for the dust to settle in terms of evaluating presidents, and I think that's largely accurate. Certainly some presidents had more charisma than others in terms of ranking and evaluation. John F. Kennedy had run for president in 1960 on the basis that Eisenhower was old, he was 70 years old, he played too much golf, we were behind in the space race, he was surrounded by people who were actually making his decisions, and so the public, because he won the election and obviously a majority of the people responded favorably to what Kennedy was saying, that within the first couple of years after Eisenhower went out of the White House, and the first ranking poll after he had left the White House, he was ranked 22nd out of our 34 presidents at the time. In other words, he was a bottom one-third president, and now he's ranked number 5. So you say, well, how'd that happen? And the answer is that when a president steps down for a while, the guts of his presidential papers are maintained in confidentiality and are not released until a period of time goes by. And so it wasn't until the Eisenhower papers became available to scholars and people in the early 90s that the people realized, no, Eisenhower really was making all these very good decisions. And this whole reevaluation of Eisenhower, many years after he had left the White House, caused everybody to rethink. This is a guy who, in fact, brought an end to the Korean War within 6 months and brought an end to McCarthyism within 1 year. And for the remainder of his presidency, it was largely a time of peace and prosperity, which is a pretty great and unusual result for an American president, to have that extended time where we have peace and prosperity.
And he was a general, of all things.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, what I mean is
commander and military hero, and
a military leader that created peace. I mean, or that went for the peace. As long as we're talking a lot about Eisenhower, let's do him first, because you make some really interesting points about him, and I think people are, just barely have some memory of him, at least in our audience. So one of the things that you say about his decision making is how patient he was to make something happen, so that he would time, you can't call it his kill, but he would time himself in the decision to be the most effective, and he was able to wait. And you mentioned Joe McCarthy.
Well, the point I make about Eisenhower is he had the wisdom to know when the best approach was a patient approach, and also, though, when the immediate response was the best result. And so I talk about McCarthy as an example of his very successful patient approach. But then I talk about his immediate and hardball response to England, France, and Israel joining forces to invade Egypt and seize the Suez Canal, how he responded immediately and fiercely and brought an end to that effort and got all of them to remove their troops out of the Suez. And so that was, and it's tied to his military expertise. He knew when to move forward with a military strategy that took some time, but he also knew how to move forward with another situation where time was of the essence, and people had to move quickly and firmly to achieve the desired results. So that's the real brilliance, is knowing which approach is going to be more successful to achieve your goal. And that's part of why Eisenhower is regarded so highly, because that's a pretty rare trait of having that sense of the right timing for the right circumstance.
Interesting that you also point out, which I found very excellent, good lawyerly skills, in that trait of being able to know when and what and how close to your vest you hold your cards when you're going to do something, was the trait of slight deception that Vice President Nixon used to manipulate Eisenhower, because Nixon knew how to play the same game. But you say that Nixon was able to manipulate Eisenhower a little bit by having the same set of skills, only he was a younger man, et cetera, et cetera. You want to go into that a little? Because I think, I've rarely heard somebody say that that's how Nixon and Eisenhower played off of each other.
Well, Eisenhower and Nixon had a very strained relationship. Specifically, Eisenhower in 1952 decided on Nixon, obviously, as his vice president. Nixon was much younger. In that 1952 timeframe, the country was still up in arms about McCarthyism, and a lot of people believed McCarthy's nonsense. A lot of people didn't. And Nixon had earned some positive results from his efforts to, in fact, target actual bona fide communist. And so it was thought that Nixon would be a great addition to provide some balance to the ticket. But then all of a sudden, long before the November election, a controversy arose about Nixon having taken money from donors for, among other things, getting him this dog Checkers. And there was a whole national controversy about whether Nixon had done something improper. And Eisenhower didn't want his running mate to be the subject of negative controversy. And so Eisenhower definitely wanted Nixon to step down and withdraw from the ticket. And yet Nixon gave the famous Checkers speech and defended what he had done. And Nixon said to Thomas Dewey, who was acting as the middleman between Eisenhower and Nixon, saying, if Eisenhower wants me off the ticket, he's going to have to tell me directly. Because Dewey was being the messenger saying, you really need to step down. And Nixon said, I'm not going to step down unless Eisenhower does it directly. Well, after the Checkers speech, which, as you know, got a lot of favorable reaction, and all of a sudden the tarnish on Nixon largely went away, Eisenhower decided to keep him on the ticket, and obviously he stayed on as vice president. But after that first term, Eisenhower was seeking a new running mate. And so the way to try to handle it in a way that wouldn't alienate Nixon, he offered him cabinet position, and Nixon viewed that as a demotion. And so Nixon refused to trade jobs. And so he stayed on as vice president second term. And then, of course, in the 1960 election, there was a press conference where somebody asked Eisenhower, can you tell us one thing in particular where Vice President Nixon helped you greatly and accomplished something great as vice president during the last 8 years? And the question caught Eisenhower off balance, and his response was, well, if you give me a week, I'll think of something. And of course, you know, the Democrats made all kinds of hay about that, and then obviously it hurt Nixon's feelings. And finally, toward the November election date in 1960, Eisenhower finally did fully engage and campaign on behalf of Nixon. But this, and then of course in the middle of all this, well, I should say afterwards, anyway, Nixon's daughter ends up marrying Eisenhower's grandson. David Eisenhower marries Julie Nixon. And so Eisenhower died in early 69. And so over those 8 or 9 years, there was a reconciliation caused in part by the fact that all of a sudden they were members of the same family, the daughter and grandson who were married and, you know, having grandchildren. So anyway, it's a very fascinating relationship between the two men who obviously were both president of the United States, but they certainly had their differences and were not, you know, chummy buddies at any point in time. But Nixon obviously ultimately succeeded in becoming president, although not until 1968. But he was not able to succeed Eisenhower the way George H.W. Bush did to Reagan.
It's interesting how the age difference in the way we perceive how old somebody is has changed since that time, because Eisenhower was considered way too old. And how old was he when he finished? Under 70, right?
He was 70.
70. And Nixon was very young, but when he was first vice president, he must have been in his 30s.
I think he was I think he was older than Kennedy, and Kennedy was elected at age 43. So I think Nixon was only a year or two older than Kennedy. But as you may know, these days, former presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush go around the country being paid large honorariums to speak to high-powered business people. And they did it at a program in Arizona a few months ago, and a friend of mine was in the audience. And the first thing that they both said was, and this was before June the 30th when Biden had his disastrous debate. But the first thing they said at the program was, both of us are younger than Trump and Biden.
Right.
Both of us are too old to be president. So the times have changed. I mean, obviously Biden crashed and burned in that debate, and Trump is at a now disadvantage since age-wise and perception-wise, because obviously Kamala Harris is 59 years old and he's almost 79 years old. So that factor is certainly there in the election that's coming in November.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody today has the sense of humor that Reagan used against Mondale in his debate, where he said that, you know, there was an age factor there too, and I think Reagan was either 69 or 70 or 71, and Mondale was 59, something like that. And so I won't use my opponent's
lack of experience
against.
Yeah. Reagan was a master wit, a master storyteller, a master joke teller. He knew how to deliver a punchline, and that was obviously a huge factor, because his first debate with Mondale, he had not done well. And the reaction to the first debate was, oh my gosh, he's too old, he's, blah, blah, blah. So when the second debate rolled around, there was really a lot riding on it in terms of him being able to demonstrate that he still had it together and in fact was capable of serving a second term. And the punchline was the one you just said, and in terms of how he responded to people's concern about his age.
Yeah. All right, so let's back up to George Washington. He was the unanimous choice for all of those, offices, and surprised the King of England that when he stepped down after 2 terms, etc. And when he stepped down, he was also in his 60s, I think, right? He wasn't really old.
He was 63, and I think he was 67 when he died. I mean, he knew that he was in decline. He knew that he wasn't strong enough for another 4 years. And in fact, he did not live another 4 years after he left the presidency. So he was right about that. But unlike, for example, I mean, we could compare, Franklin Roosevelt was not going to leave the presidency until he died. And that would include winning that 4th election when he was clearly dying. But the circumstances are different. I mean, obviously, he's the commander-in-chief. World War II is still going on. You don't switch horses in the middle of a world war if you can avoid it. And so anyway, slightly different and importantly different circumstances between FDR staying on forever until he died, as opposed to Washington's making the decision to leave at a time when everybody would have been delighted if he had agreed to a 3rd term. But he was ready to go back to Mount Vernon. People don't realize during the American Revolution, which lasted 8 years, and he was our commander-in-chief all 8 years, he only went to Mount Vernon for like 2 or 3 days. I mean, he was away so much of the time, and just the extended service to the country from the Revolutionary War and then Constitutional Convention and then 2 terms as president. I mean, he knew he was worn out, and of course in those days the average lifespan was a lot different than what we have today, and people's attention to their diet and so on and so forth, it causes people to live longer. But anyway, he's rated as our 2nd greatest president. Obviously, it was a fragile, brand new nation. Nobody knew if it, in fact, was going to survive for any length of time. He viewed his job, the big part of his job, to be unifier in chief and to be conscience in chief. A great advocate for the importance of virtue and integrity in anybody with the responsibility to lead the government, and he fulfilled those responsibilities admirably. So there's a good reason why he's ranked among our 2 greatest presidents and why he's on Mount Rushmore.
So we have Washington, we have Jefferson, and both slave owners. And there's been a lot of talk for about the last 25 years or so about how slavery was a part of the way we got started. And I think that's not sophisticated enough explanation of what was going on then, because there were certainly a lot of people against slavery, and there were a lot of people for slavery. I think it's hard to remember that Virginia was the biggest state, I mean, the most population, and produced most of the first presidents, right? A large number came from Virginia.
Well, it was all about the economy.
Mm-hmm.
The people who opposed slavery were largely in the North, where there were not large plantations that required a lot of manpower, whereas in the South, including Virginia, there were many large plantations, and nobody could have enough children to be able to work those plantations successfully. There was not yet a surge of immigrant workers ready to work on behalf of plantation owners. Slavery obviously was permitted under the Constitution. And so the decision, if you were going to own a lot of land, like both Jefferson and Washington did, and you wanted to maximize what you did with your land from an economic standpoint, you had to have a labor force. And so, yes, it was immoral. They knew it was immoral, but they also knew that if they freed all their slaves, then their plantations couldn't be worked successfully at all. So that was the bind that they, of course, Madison owned slaves as well. And I think Monroe did it as well. I can't remember. I think Andrew Jackson perhaps did as well. But it was all a matter of economic necessity for anybody who was main source of income was the agriculture and the land. Of course, in time, and particularly it all came to a head with the expansion of the United States to the West, and this whole issue of are we going to allow slavery in the West, and to what portion? And we get into the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which Stephen Douglas championed, where the whole issue was, let's let each state or each territory decide whether they want to have slavery or not, thereby nullifying the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which at least tried to keep things in balance between slave and non-slave states. And it was that 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, which Abraham Lincoln, all of a sudden, who had taken a break from active politics, said he was thunderstruck that the Missouri Compromise would be nullified, and that people seemed to want, or at least a big portion of the American people wanted slavery to be expanded into the Western territories. And that was the issue that led to the Civil War. But that Lincoln, being our greatest president, used that opportunity as the springboard for ultimately bringing about an end to slavery in every state. So history plays out over time. Washington, at least, George Washington, at least, had a sufficiently guilty conscience about having owned slaves that toward the very end of his life, he rewrote his will to free the slaves that he owned upon his death. But Jefferson did not do that. The only slaves that Jefferson freed were his children and grandchildren from Sally Hemings, his slave.
His slave, Sally Hemings. So I think most people are familiar with the story, but I think one thing that's missed is that Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Jefferson's wife, right?
Yeah, Sally Hemings and Martha Jefferson both had the same father. That man, Mr. Randolph, was like, and this was not uncommon, that people who owned slaves thought they owned them and could basically do with them whatever they thought they wanted to do, which included sexual relations. And obviously we look back on it now with horror and can't imagine any such state of mind in our country, but nonetheless, history demonstrates that that's the way it was in many instances. And so, of course, Jefferson's wife died at a young age, she'd had some children. But anyway, soon thereafter, Jefferson goes abroad and is an American diplomat in France, and he brings one of his daughters over, who brings one of her slaves, who's taking care of her, who happens to be Sally Hemings. He's like 14 years old. Mm-hmm. And it all got started over there. You know, Jefferson was a widower, and there was Sally Hemings, and it got started over there. And Sally Hemings was obviously a very smart person, and recognized that while she was in France as a slave, she had every right to declare herself free, because slavery wasn't permitted in France. And she made a deal with Jefferson that if she agreed to go back to Monticello with him, that he would agree to free her descendants at a later time. So that was the deal they struck. Mm-hmm. And they went back to Virginia, and obviously over time she did have several children. And by the DNA testing, as well as looking at when Jefferson would come to Monticello, and he was away from Monticello much of the time, mm-hmm. you know, as president and secretary of state under Washington and so forth, that when he would return to Monticello for brief visits, and then go back to where he was, Philadelphia, Washington, wherever he was, 9 months later, Sally Hemings would be having a baby. So it's a fascinating story. Annette Gordon Reed won the Pulitzer for her book, The Hemings of Monticello, and goes into great detail about the whole story. It's not exactly Thomas Jefferson's proudest moments,
right.
And that part of, we talked about in each chapter, I go through the president's flaws. I go into that in the Jefferson chapter, just as I obviously have to address it in the John F. Kennedy chapter about his serial philandering while he was president. But the focus of my book is, number one, recognizing that they were flawed and did some things that obviously no one should be proud of, but for purposes of American history, they also did great things for the country that allow us to have had the successful history we've had.
It'd be interesting to write a book, not that you have to do it, but about the wives of presidents who were very, who understood the situation with their husbands and then made agreements like Sally Hemings, because there are quite a few who had the same sort of, this is like our prenup, or this is, if we're going to keep moving forward, this is how we're going to do it. Because I can think of quite a few, but we won't go into that.
But good. It makes for interesting reading. Roosevelt and Jackie Kennedy come to mind immediately.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So they understand it. It doesn't matter. They were raised one way. It's a context in which they were raised, the culture of theirs. Everybody from the outside says, how can you make those decisions? But they seem very different to people who are raised in a different culture, like George Bernard Shaw writes in his story about Eliza Doolittle and that became My Fair Lady, and he says, "Middle class morality, I can't afford it." It's so let's go back to Jefferson. That was his weakness, but Jefferson had a way. He was obviously very passionate about and the creator, in a sense, of the political party split after Washington between the Federalists and his vision. And I think one of the things you say really well about him is that his strength as a leader had a lot to do with his vision of what he wanted the country to be like, where he wanted it to go. So why don't you talk about that, because people do talk about that Jeffersonian vision, but and good timing. He was able to buy from Napoleon when he needed it.
Well, he was obviously a brilliant person, and that was a big part of his being able to create this vision for the future of the country, and then succeed in executing on that vision, and America following it for years to come. such that he's president for 8 years. He's followed by his best friend Madison for 8 years. He's followed by his buddy Monroe for 8 years. Then there's a little 4-year window for John Quincy Adams, but then there's Andrew Jackson for another 8 years. So for the first 36 years of the 19th century, 32 of those years were Thomas Jefferson and his, soulmates and political soulmates. And so the impact that Jefferson had, not only on the years he was president, but in the years that followed. But what really stands out to me from the Jefferson presidency, well, you mentioned, obviously, Louisiana Purchase is a huge deal. And the leadership trait that I ascribe to that transaction is that of principled pragmatism. That on the one hand, when Napoleon brought this opportunity to Jefferson at such a bargain price, Jefferson's first reaction was, hey, I've read the Constitution. I think that before we can make this deal, we got to have a constitutional amendment. But then he realized that that would take quite a bit of time. And during that time, Napoleon might well change his mind and the opportunity would go away. And so he modified his principles about the importance of a constitutional amendment and moved forward with pragmatism, not to lose what was obviously an unbelievable deal that doubled the size of the country. So this concept of principled pragmatism is one that Reagan followed. James Baker likes to frequently talk about principled pragmatism as being essential to being a successful president and political leader. But the part about Jefferson that I think is most important, particularly for 2024, in all of our polarization and the breakdown and communication and relationships between people of different parties, Jefferson obviously succeeded John Adams. John Adams had been a very divisive president. He was a Federalist. Congress was controlled by the Federalists during his presidency. Adams notoriously had a very thin skin. He hated criticism. So he and Congress got together and enacted the Sedition Act, which made it a crime punishable by incarceration for anybody to criticize Adams or any Federalist policy. And so during Adams' presidency, people were actually thrown in jail for exercising their First Amendment freedom of speech and freedom of the press rights. Fortunately, the Sedition Act expired by its own terms at the end of Adams' term. But on Jefferson's first day as our third president, he's coming out of a situation where there's been that kind of crazy division and polarization such that political opponents were being incarcerated. And so in Jefferson's first inaugural address, he says to the people gathered, look, folks, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, i.e. we're all Americans. And we better start acting that way or this new country is not going to survive. Now, Jefferson was not a great public speaker, and neither was Washington. But Jefferson was a master relationship builder, one-on-one and in small groups. And so over the course of his 8-year presidency, 2 to 3 times every week for 8 years, he hosted dinners where he would have Federalists and he would have Republicans and he would people who were in disagreement. And he would say, we're going to drink a lot of wine. We're going to eat a lot of great food. We're not going to talk about hot button political issues. We're going to talk about history, literature, music, what we do for a living, what our family is. In other words, we're going to talk about the things that people talk about when they want to become friends. And you didn't all of a sudden have friends after 1 dinner or 3 dinners or 5 dinners. But over the course of 8 years, 2 to 3 dinners a week, the walls started tumbling down. Mm-hmm. People realized, I can like you, I can enjoy your company, even though we disagree on political issues. And so now there is a new movement. You can Google Jefferson dinners as something we need now for people to recognize that we need to be building relationships so that, famously, if somebody likes you, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And if they don't, they won't. And people have decided they don't like each other merely on the basis of their political parties or who they're supporting for president or where they are on particular legislation or social issues and shutting the door on the possibility of being able to work together and cross the aisle and do the things that are essential for us to have effective government. And that was what Jefferson really got the country on the right track that, followed with the presidents who succeeded him. But he was the master relationship builder who broke down walls, who got people in a mode of civil discourse, in a mode of mutual respect. And he was persistent and hardworking in that respect and successful. And that's something obviously we wish that people in the 21st century spent more time deciding that they need to get along, they need to have mutual respect, they need to have civil discourse, they need to recognize the importance of compromise to enacting legislation that needs to be enacted. I mean, these are all the things that we need to be thinking about now, that Jefferson was the master of during his presidency.
Yeah, we really need it when people are nostalgic for Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, a couple of old Irish guys who, they bonded over that. But there aren't a lot of friendships like that to look back to in the 40 years since then. One of the things that you said, and you've mentioned the book several times, this thing about principled pragmatism, you want to accomplish something, you realize you can only do it one way. And obviously a lot of people use the expression, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. And I think that's the way things get done, right?
I think on this subject of principled pragmatism, you look back at Lincoln, and when he brought forth the Emancipation Proclamation, he didn't know if it was constitutional. He hoped it was. He hoped that as a matter of military necessity, that he could justify the proclamation. But as a pragmatist, and particularly as a military strategist, he realized that he needed the freed slaves from the Confederate States, who, after the Emancipation Proclamation was put into effect, they could run away and have freedom in the North. And he needed them to supplement and grow the Northern Army in order to win the Civil War. And so he justified the Emancipation Proclamation on the basis of military necessity. He had also justified revoking the right of habeas corpus on the basis of military necessity. But again, the pragmatist, he's saying, look, nobody in their right mind would say, in terms of the Constitution versus the ultimate survival of the country, it's okay to cut off a limb to save the rest of the body. And obviously in the Civil War, with all the people who were wounded, there were literally millions of amputations. That was in the forefront of his mind, because in those days, medicine, that was the way it worked in dealing with so many injuries. But this is what great leaders do. They obviously keep their principles in the forefront of their mind, but they also must maintain the big picture of what absolutely needs to be done, and not let technicalities or arguable technicalities prevent them from achieving great things, like purchasing Louisiana, like bringing an end to slavery. Those types of things are what great leaders do.
I'd like to talk to the live stream audience for just a second. If you have any questions, you can send them in to us in the chat room. We have several questions, and are going to get to them. But before we get to them, we have to get to the other president out of the 8, which is Teddy Roosevelt. I don't think we've said much about him, and he was quite a character. And as you said, one of his weaknesses was he got a little bit too full of himself after he was president. But he was like a big boy as the president, too, the way he dealt with a lot of things. But on the other hand, he was very effective. So why don't you tell a little bit about how Teddy did things?
Well, the most important thing in my mind about Theodore Roosevelt was that he grew the presidency. he realized that there were things that needed to be done that Congress was not going to do. And so it was up to the president. And so the expansion of presidential powers in areas where they needed to go, such that he stepped into this middle of the national coal strike and brought an end to it as the mediator. No American president had ever been involved in a labor dispute before. But with winter coming on and a national coal strike, people were going to start freezing to death unless the strike came to an end. And so he solved that problem. He also invoked the Sherman Act and moved his Justice Department to start busting the trusts. He also obviously decided that we needed to preserve our national parks and wildlife refuges a whole lot more than had ever been done before. He also decided that as a matter of American commerce, we need to do what we need to do to get the Panama Canal completed and working operational so that it could be a means by which people wouldn't have to go all the way around South America in order to get to the Pacific Ocean. So he was looking for ways that things that needed to change, and he found ways to achieve them for the betterment of the country. And so that's why, even though during his presidency there wasn't a Great Depression, there wasn't a world war, there weren't the kinds of national crises that typically cause a president who handles those crises successfully to be recognized as great. He didn't have that, but he's recognized as our fourth greatest. He's the fourth president on Mount Rushmore because this expansion of the presidency under his leadership turned out to be such a great thing for America.
This is a slight tangent, but you mentioned Elihu Root as being an advisor. It's a name that sounds like it should be back in the 18th century. But Elihu Root was also the founder of a law firm in New York that Thomas Dewey, who lost to Truman, eventually became in charge of, and I eventually went and worked at the same place. So Elihu Root, do you know anything else about him? I mean, he was a sort of corporate mover behind the scenes guy at the time.
I haven't studied the life of it. I think it's pronounced Elihu Root.
Elihu? Probably, yeah.
And if you have any baseball fans watching, in Cooperstown, New York, when there was an Abner Doubleday myth that the game of baseball had been invented in Cooperstown, New York, it supposedly took place on Elihu Finney's cow pasture. That's the only other. Those are the only two Elihus I've ever heard in history. But, Theodore Roosevelt surrounded himself with very capable people, one of whom was Elihu Root. But I'm not prepared to.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so we have a lot of good questions from our audience. And the first one is, during the research for your book, did you learn anything that surprised or shocked you?
Well, Thomas Jefferson, during his 8-year presidency, gave a grand total of 2 speeches. Only 2 speeches he gave were his inaugural address. I had read much about Washington beforehand, so I guess what I learned about Washington was that he started out in a bad place by misbehaving in multiple instances during the French and Indian War. But one of the most important things was he learned from his mistakes, such that he didn't repeat them thereafter. During the French and Indian War, he was an aggressive and obnoxious self-promoter. Invariably got put down and didn't get promoted the way he thought he should. And thereafter, as you said earlier, people think, oh gosh, he stepped away from power after the Revolutionary War. He stepped away from power after his presidency. He was not a self-promoter. This is what great leaders do. But you can go back to his life story, and I talk about this, the first trait, he learned from his mistakes. Lincoln, I've read so many Lincoln books over the course of my life that, in fact, my book, In the 8 Presidents, has a total of 24 leadership traits, with none of them duplicated among the presidents. And I think a good argument can be made that Lincoln had all 24 traits, and I don't think you can say that about any of the other great presidents. So selecting traits from Lincoln that people hadn't focused perhaps on: his magnanimity, his willingness to forgive and not take the bait and stay above the fray with his cabinet, with Union generals, with his wife Mary, who was a really difficult spouse. I hadn't really focused on how comprehensive his magnanimity was.
Mm-hmm.
Theodore Roosevelt, nothing comes to mind. Franklin Roosevelt, I did not have a good appreciation for how locked in America was to being isolationists in the late 30s and early 40s when Hitler was taking over Europe, and most Americans didn't want any part of being part of that war. And the process by which FDR, who knew we had to get involved in that war or Hitler was going to take over the rest of the world, would be coming at the United States. But his process through his fireside chats of getting Americans to rethink their position, rethink their being committed to isolationism, recognizing the importance of joining the war effort in order to bring an end to Hitler's reign of terror, is a real masterpiece in the art of communication. Eisenhower, the first leadership trait I talk about was his genius in organization. So if anybody who's watching this is a leader of a large organization, and of course he had learned as the Supreme Allied Commander how to organize all these different countries' armies and make them work together successfully, but the way he ran his cabinet, the way he ran his National Security Council, the way he ran his Office of Congressional Liaison, the way he ran his meetings, the way he got people to debate and be forthcoming and giving conflicting opinions so that they could, argue it out and reach the best decision. Kennedy, obviously, I had never focused before on how his greatest speeches, not only were they eloquent in and of themselves, but the fact that they moved America forward, whether we're talking about the Peace Corps from his first inaugural address and all the good results that came from it, his speech at Rice Stadium about the Moonshot program and why it was so important to America's ultimately prevailing in the Cold War, and then his nationally televised speech on civil rights, and that led to his submitting the first ever strong civil rights bill that he died before he got it through Congress. Fortunately, Lyndon Johnson did. But just the power of his words and the fact that they were so powerful, because as a student of history, he had learned from Lincoln, you got to appeal to the better angels of people's natures and not to their dark sides. And then Reagan, last but not least, this incredible sense of optimism that not only he had, but that he inspired throughout the country in bringing an end to the Cold War, reviving the American economy, and restoring American self-confidence after Jimmy Carter's failed presidency, where there was double-digit inflation, high unemployment, low economic growth, long gas lines, and American hostages that he couldn't get released from Iran, America in a state of national malaise, and Reagan being the person who brought us out of the malaise and caused us to regain our self-confidence and our commitment to American exceptionalism. So kind of president by president, those are the things that stand out.
You mentioned in the book several times, and you mentioned it now just speaking about FDR, that one way of leading successfully is only to stay one step ahead of the audience. Not 2 or 3 steps ahead, but to stay one step ahead, and if you can bring them that step, then you take the next step. If you're going to try to move somebody. Right? I
think, that's a lesson in communication, that when people are locked into a position and you, the leader, are wanting them to rethink that position, you have to communicate in a way that allows them to process and grasp and reflect before they're going to come around. Mm-hmm. I mean, famously, Norman Vincent Peale said, "Convince a man against his will, and he's of his opinion still," which is typically the way arguments go, and why arguments almost never result in somebody saying, "Oh, yeah, you're right, I'm wrong." It doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. But it's a process, it's a communication process that over time can cause people to rethink their positions, but only if the information that's going into their heads is submitted in a form that allows them to do that, as opposed to beating them over the head with this nation-changing policy that they can't even begin to even think about or process or reflect before it's being jammed down their throat. That's not the way it works. If Roosevelt in the late 30s said, we're going to war, we have to. Hitler's not for real. I know you didn't like to fight in World War I, but this is what we're going to do. He didn't want to do that. He, student of history, knew about Lincoln. You got to follow the public sentiment. And to move the public sentiment, you've got to do it in increments. And that's why he was so successful.
Here's another good question. Who is a president outside of your top 8 that doesn't get enough recognition for their leadership? So who's in the next rung that is overlooked?
Obviously, if I'd written about the 9 top presidents, I probably would have plugged Harry Truman in, the Marshall Plan, and his integrity and the fact that he would definitely be in the mix. The president who is a tough one is LBJ. And the reason is because obviously, other than Abraham Lincoln, he is our greatest civil rights president. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Housing Act, a legislative genius and capacity to get legislation passed that we've never had before or since. But the problem with LBJ in putting him among the top 8 is you can't get over Vietnam. And his decision to escalate Vietnam, the way I look at it, Vietnam was an insoluble mess. There were no right answers. There were no good answers. There were reasons to escalate. There were reasons to pull out. It was complicated. Nothing was clear. It was a morass. And LBJ, who, unlike Eisenhower, had never been a serious soldier or had any sort of military leadership, would listen to these military leaders who, for the most part, were not giving him good advice, just as they had not given Kennedy good advice in the Bay of Pigs, and who weren't giving him good advice in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But Kennedy had enough sense and command to overrule his military leaders. Johnson wasn't able to do that, and so they led him down the path toward escalating Vietnam. And since it was an insoluble, chaotic mess, the main problem I have with Johnson's handling of Vietnam was not necessarily the decisions he made so much as the fact that he repeatedly lied to the American people about what was going on. And that's now well known, well documented. And I can't sit here and sing the praises of an American president who, on such an important matter, was lying to the American people repeatedly.
Yeah, and I think there's no question for our generation that lying seemed obvious at the time, but we were kids. But it still seemed obvious. And when it proved to be true that it was lying, it really undercut the respect for all kinds of things, which is part of the difficulty we have. So let's finish with one question from the audience. Looking at the upcoming election, what strengths, leadership strengths, do each of the candidates have? So you said there's 24 of them. You don't even have to say which ones. You can say one has 12, one has 9. I'm just kidding. But you can talk about it a little bit because it does seem to be a different situation than.
It's a very different situation.
Yeah,
we don't have George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan running in this election, or anybody close to their capabilities. In terms of Trump, one of the traits that I mentioned previously in this interview was that he knew how to play hardball in certain circumstances. And Trump, and the way he's played hardball, in particular with our allies in NATO to make sure they pay their fair share and we're not overpaying. I mean, you could make an argument that in negotiations, at least in some of his negotiations, he knows how to negotiate along those lines successfully in certain instances. You can also say that he has communication powers among his base. I don't think we've ever had an American populist who grabbed a hold of, 48, 49% of the American people. And obviously, many people don't like what he says or what he's been communicating and so on and so forth, which I totally understand and respect. But you do have to step back and say, he has built this huge army of supporters who will follow him anywhere, regardless of how many untruths he says or these kind of things. So, there's something to be said, even though it's hard to recognize it positively, but it's something to be said about his communication style that has caused him over time to attract the followers that he has.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of Kamala Harris, to me, she's still an unknown quantity. It's hard to identify her great leadership traits because, she's never a state governor. She was a senator for a short period of time. She's been a low-profile vice president, didn't take the initiative on anything except the abortion issue. And now here she is, an unwillingness to answer questions responsively, to take on many hardball questions in interviews from people from different networks. And so there's a lot about Kamala Harris that we just don't know. And given the fact that it appears there's not going to be another debate, we may not know. And so the fact that she's changed so many of her policies since she became the presumptive and now the actual nominee compared to her prior positions on these issues without having fully explained the basis for why she made such dramatic shifts in her policy. These are things that we need explanations on. But, just as Trump, you can step back and say, well, he has done an amazing job of attracting a whole bunch of people to support him. What Kamala Harris did once Biden stepped down in immediately getting the entirety of the Democratic Party to support her, such that there was never any process by which any other potential contender ever got a sniff of a possibility of becoming the new Democratic Party nominee. You have to, tip your hat that, that was quite a political achievement to do it as quickly and as successfully as she did. So those are some political maneuvering skills that you have to step back and admire. And obviously, even though she was not necessarily highly regarded by the American people during her vice presidency because she was so low profile, now all of a sudden she's got, 49, 50, whatever it is percent who think she's the one. Now, whether that's because they believe she's the one or whether they're just saying, I can never vote for Trump, and so I'm for whoever is running against Trump. That's who I'm for. The anti-Trump, that's who I'm for. But nonetheless, you have to, in this very short period of time, she has accomplished amazing political achievements that you have to admire because they're hard to believe that it all happened so quickly and so successfully.
That's a great way to end the analysis from your book, because you analyze both Trump and Harris based on their leadership skills and not the policy and what they believed or anything like that, but just what skills they had to get themselves in the position they were in. And Harris surprised a lot of people. And we're from San Francisco. It's not as big a surprise because she did some things like that when she was here in different places. So it was great, Talmadge. Thank you very much for joining us. And so ends another event, the Commonwealth Club, in its 121st year of enlightened discussion. We really appreciate that you joined us today, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Talmadge. Oh, and the book?
Folks, the book, How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. Since I'm not there in person to be able to market it, if you like what you've heard and you're interested, I'd certainly appreciate it if you pull it up on Amazon and look it over, and if it seems attractive, give it a try.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again. Thanks, everyone.